This is the first lesson in a unit covering the Civil War and Reconstruction, and in this lesson we are going to take a look at several events that divided the nation and brought us to civil war. The first item that we're going to take a look at actually occurred well before the 1850s. Congress passed the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and it is also known as the Compromise of 1820. And in this compromise, three things happened. First, Missouri enters the Union as a slave state. Second, Maine enters the Union as a free state. And lastly, Congress drew a line, the red line that you see here, at the 3630 north latitude line, and decided to prohibit slavery north of that line in the territories north of that line, and to allow slavery in the territories south of that line. It was important that Missouri and Maine be brought into the Union at the same time together, meaning one free state and one slave state, because at this point in time, the United States had the same number of slave states and free states, which meant that neither side in Congress had an advantage over the other. In the Senate, the number of free state senators and slave state senators were exactly the same. The House of Representatives was controlled by the free states because the population of the free states was larger than the population of the slave states, so the House of Representatives had more free state congressmen than slave state congressmen. Congress would turn its attention to other matters and not deal with slavery legislation again for another 30 years. Moving forward 30 years into the future, Congress tackles the issue again. This time it bundles a series of different items together to create the Compromise of 1850. Item number one, California enters the Union as a free state. At this point, gold had been discovered in California a couple of years prior to this. People flocked out to California. They had enough of a population to apply for statehood, and Congress accepted them in as a free state, which was as California wanted. Keep in mind, you do not see a corresponding entrance to the Union of a slave state. This will now tip the balance of power in the United States Senate in favor of the free states. Item 2, the slave trade is now going to come to an end in Washington, D.C. This does not mean that slavery is going to end in Washington, D.C., just the auctioning of slaves was going to end. Number 3, this was what Southerners wanted, and probably why slave states representatives in Congress allowed for the change in balance of power. The strict new fugitive slave law. Runaway slaves were a source of concern for the southern states, and the lack of northern involvement in helping to return runaway slaves was something that Southerners complained about. Now, as a result of this compromise, everybody was required to help catch and return runaways. Flipping this around a minute, if you were caught helping or harboring fugitives, the penalties were severe, both in terms of fines and jail time. Item number 4, people in the Mexican territories would decide on slavery by popular sovereignty, or voting on it. What had happened after we acquired the American Southwest, specifically the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, from Mexico in the Mexican War, Congress was now left with the decision as to whether or not to allow slavery in those territories. Congress could not make a decision whether or not to allow slavery in those territories, so they decided to allow the people that would move out there eventually to vote on whether they themselves wanted to allow slavery or not. And again, that term is called popular sovereignty. So these 4 items were cobbled together in one compromise, and this was meant to end many of the different concerns. I shouldn't say end as opposed to put to rest many of the different concerns at the time regarding various different slave-related issues. This map shows that California entered the Union as a free state and indicates the area that was going to be decided, where slavery was going to be decided by popular sovereignty. as per the Compromise of 1850. Right away, Northerners didn't want to help return fugitive slaves. You can see the poster on the left warning when slave catchers were in an area of a northern city. The map on the right indicates routes that the Underground Railroad used to help runaways get to Canada. Those routes involved many people helping runaways try and make their way to Canada. So many Northerners ignored the fugitive slave law and their responsibilities under the fugitive slave law. This would again cause a significant division between the North and the South. In 1854, Congress is going to inject itself into the slavery issue again and cause a significant amount of controversy. In this case, they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and what they decided was to allow for popular sovereignty, meaning settlers to vote on slavery in the area outlined in blue on the map. The black line indicates the original Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line, and you'll remember that they had decided back in 1820 that slavery should not exist north of that line in those territories outlined in blue. So by Congress doing what it did, it led to, trying to move, there we go, it led to slave owners moving from Missouri largely over into Kansas territory, and free soilers, people that were abolitionists or against slavery, also moving into the Kansas territory to affect the outcome of this vote. So now you have people passionate on both sides of this political hot potato issue that were now neighbors with each other, and fighting broke out. The newspapers labeled this fighting Bleeding Kansas, and this is the first time we're going to have blood shed over the issue of slavery. It won't be the last. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin was another issue in the 1850s that was very divisive. This was an anti-slavery novel that depicted the evils and horrors of slavery. That was widely read in the North, and believe it or not, most Northerners were not aware of the day-to-day goings-on of slavery. So after reading this book, many Northerners that were hadn't given much thought to slavery or were unconcerned about it, after reading the book, became abolitionists. So it turned many Northerners into abolitionists, and Southerners were upset at its publication. They felt that as a novel, it depicted all slave owners as evil and dramatically misinterpreted what slavery was. So again, it's simply another example of something that happened in the 1850s that further divided the nation, North from South. In 1858, the Supreme Court announced the Dred Scott decision. A little background first. Dred Scott was a slave. I'll come to the map here. His owner was, they lived in Missouri, and his owner brought him up to the Minnesota Territory for about a year. And you'll notice, obviously, Minnesota Territory is free territory. Then after about a year or so, they came back to Missouri. His owner died. So people sued on Dred Scott's behalf for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territory. And that was the basis of this case, which made its way to the Supreme Court. In 1858, the court decided two things that you see here. One, slaves could not use the courts because they were the property of their owners. They were not citizens, had no right to sue in court. Additionally, they decided that Congress never had the authority to draw the 3630 line in the first place back in the Missouri Compromise. Therefore, it was unconstitutional and had to be removed. What that did, by removing the Missouri Compromise line, that had the effect of legalizing slavery in all the territories. So It should come as no surprise that Southerners, when they found out about this decision, were very happy that slavery was now extended into all U.S. territory, not states' territory, and Northerners were furious with the decision. So again, another example of how an event in the 1850s divided. The last straw for Southerners is going to be the election of 1860. And you can see on this chart here, the election of 1860 was a four-way race. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican candidate, and he would win. We'll talk about that in a second. The Democratic candidate, I should say the Democratic Party, was split into two, and they were split over the issue of slavery. You can see here the southern states largely voted for the Southern Democratic candidate, John Breckinridge. The northern states voted for the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln won. You can see here the electoral vote. Lincoln received 180 electoral votes, which was well more than the 51% that he needed, or I should say 1 plus half that he needed to win the presidency. So Southerners, seeing that he won the presidency and did not win a single Southern state to win the presidency, Southerners felt like now, in addition to Congress being in the hands of the free states, the presidency was in the hands of the free states. And we'll see in the upcoming lessons, it's going to start with the state of South Carolina. They're going to decide they've had enough. They no longer want to be a part of the United States, and they're going to secede. And they're going to secede or break away from this country before Lincoln is even sworn in. This is something that we're going to talk about in the coming lessons. So to sum up then, all of the events that we've taken a look at in this lesson divided the nation. All right, the Compromise of 1850 was divisive. California, coming in as a free state, gave the Senate, or gave control of the Senate to the free states. And the Fugitive Slave Law was not followed by Northerners who refused to help capture runaways and return them. The Kansas-Nebraska Act led to bloodshed out in Kansas when pro-slavery and anti-slavery folks moved out there to affect the vote out in Kansas. Uncle Tom's Cabin divided the nation in its publication and making Northerners aware of the evils of slavery. And of course, the Dred Scott decision was highly divisive in its legalization of slavery in all the territories and in not allowing slaves to use the courts because they were property. Number two, the election of 1860 placed control of the presidency into Northern hands. At least that's how Southerners felt about Abraham Lincoln winning that election. And South Carolina is going to lead in seceding from the Union. And when Lincoln is sworn in March, 7 Southern states had already seceded from the Union. That number will become 11, and they're going to form the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, and the nation will be plunged into civil war.